University's reputation as a training ground for generations of citizen soldiers and as a pioneer in American higher education. I learned today that Norwich was not just the first private military college in the nation, it is also the birthplace of ROTC, the first military college to accept women and home to the nation's oldest collegiate band. But while this university obviously honors tradition, it is also clearly focused on the future. And this matters because when today's students become tomorrow's graduates, they will be called upon to help their nation succeed in a world that is being constantly transformed. After my visits earlier today with both military and civilian students, I think our country will be very, very well served. The cadets I met with and the other students seemed to me both incredibly young and extremely bright. And they asked great questions, exemplifying this university's commitment to, and I quote, tolerate all opinions when reason is left free to combat them, unquote. The students' concerns today reflected a mixture of pride in our country and anxiety about the future, concerns which I am sure are shared by this whole audience. All of this gives us an awful lot to talk about this evening, so I will look forward later to your questions, and since I'm no longer in the government, I will actually be able to answer them. At the outset, I would, however, briefly like to share with you some of the experiences that shaped my own view of the world and America's role in it. Like many Americans, I didn't begin my life in this country. I was born in Czechoslovakia only 2 years before Adolf Hitler's troops marched into the capital city of Prague. My father was a diplomat at the time and unwilling to cooperate with the Nazis, and so my parents and I fled to England, which is where we spent World War II. Among my first memories are those of sitting with our neighbors during air raids, huddled together in a shelter, while enemy bombers flew overhead waiting for the all-clear sound. Our anxieties were heightened because the war in Europe had not begun well, and it seemed that we, who had found refuge in Great Britain, might be left to fight alone. But then, one day, wonderful news came from across the sea. A brave nation had answered the call and was on its way to rescue freedom. Soon, American soldiers and airmen arrived in England, bringing with them their boundless energy, confident wisecracks, and funny way of walking. On the streets of British cities and towns, children like me trailed along behind them in awe of their uniforms and all that they represented. Then, in early June 1944, the troops were suddenly nowhere to be seen. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious landing in history, had been launched. In the months that followed, almost an entire continent lost to evil had to be taken back, village by village, hill by hill. It was an assault carried out against a dug-in positions amid rain and mud and blood and darkness, winnable only through unbelievable courage and unbearable loss. In those days, the entire spectrum of human possibility was on display, from the soulless terror of Buchenwald and Auschwitz to the selfless bravery of Allied warriors. My father, who also volunteered to serve as an air raid warden, was head of broadcasting for the Czechoslovak government in exile. As the fighting progressed, he reported each breakthrough to the millions of people back home, secretly listening in cellars and attics. I still remember celebrating the Allied victory, and for the first but not the last time, fell in love with Americans in uniform. I was just 8 years old when the war ended and we returned to Prague. Because the fighting was over, my parents and I did our best to settle in and resume a normal life. But within a couple of years, the government of Czechoslovakia was taken over by the communists. So once again, my family was forced into exile, this time sailing across the ocean to a new and welcoming home. We arrived in New York on Veterans Day, November 11th, 1948. I will always be grateful for the warm reception we received and for the opportunity I had to grow up in a country that cherished freedom. For as long as she lived, My mother used to call me on the 4th of July and want to know whether her grandchildren were singing patriotic songs. As for my father, he used to cite a contrast. He said that in Europe, people would say to refugees, "We're so sorry for your troubles and that your country's been taken over by a terrible system. I hope you have everything that you need, and by the way, when are you going home?" But when we came to America, people would say, "We're so sorry your country's been taken over by a terrible system. You're welcome here, and when will you become citizens?" You can't imagine how privileged I felt when as Secretary of State, I flew to important meetings on a plane bearing the pride title, United States of America, and could sit behind a sign that said the United States. While in office, I seized every opportunity I had to visit with our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who were stationed overseas. And like the cadets at this university, these were men and women from across our land, representing every variety of background, race, color, and creed. I was impressed by their enthusiasm and commitment, whether their assignments were in Europe, the Balkans, the Arabian Peninsula, or East Asia. When sitting with these military people, I never heard a single complaint. Well, perhaps that's not quite true. After all, just because someone is in the military doesn't mean they're too shy to speak up. And yet the most frequent concern those young people shared had nothing to do with personal comfort. It was the fear that folks back home didn't really understand how important their mission was or how much good they were doing on behalf of the United States. I was deeply troubled by this and saw in it a reflection of the era in which we live. Next week marks 67 years since I first came to the United States. It was a time when images of American battlefield valor were fresh on the minds of Americans and freedom-loving people across the globe. In the time since, the two world wars in Korea have receded in memory, as first Vietnam and then the Persian Gulf and then Afghanistan, then in Iraq again and then Afghanistan again, and now perhaps Iraq again have moved to the fore. Meanwhile, the technology of warfare has changed, and so have the tactics. The enemy now strives to remain invisible, and the means that it uses are unconventional. We still speak of the military in heroic terms, but these do not always feel like heroic times. Our military engagements in this young century have played out against a complicated political backdrop, tinged with religious and cultural tension, questioning allies, less than conclusive results, and an American public that has often seemed disengaged. A recent battlefield death in Iraq, the first since 2011, was a reminder that each day our fighting men and women are still putting themselves at considerable risk in service to our nation. As one citizen, I acknowledge an enormous debt for me to those in this audience and those in this community who have chosen to contribute their energy and talents to the armed forces of our country. The debt extends to all of our veterans, some of whom bear permanent scars of battle, and all of whom merit a permanent place of respect in our collective memory and in our hearts. And yet, as I stand here, a week before Veterans Day 2015, I have to ask how well that debt is being repaid. It seems to me that if we are intent on protecting the security and prosperity of our country, we would have long ago put an end to the partisan squabbling and developed a unified and lasting approach to the federal budget that restores military readiness and supports all instruments of national power. The agreement reached last week in Washington was a welcome step in this direction, but its 2-year duration practically guarantees that there will be more confrontations in the future. As this political season heats up, I hope that everyone agrees we must always ensure that our fighting men and women have leadership, training, and equipment second to none, and that our military families are treated with the respect they deserve before, during, and after the fighting is done. But just as importantly, we have to resist the suggestion, heard more and more often, that we Americans need not bother about problems overseas, and that if we just mind our own business, nothing like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 will ever happen again. After nearly 15 years of continuous warfare in places far removed from the rugged beauty of Vermont, I can certainly understand the temptation to turn inward. But while we may be tired of dealing with aggressors, tyrants, and terrorists, they are not tired of us. Clearly, the world is a troubled place. Al-Qaeda's core leadership has been weakened, but even more dangerous and deranged successor groups have arisen in the Middle East and North Africa. In this evolving terrorist landscape, no group has gained more infamy than ISIS, which calls itself the Islamic State, but is neither Islamic nor a state. Many in the region now call it Daesh, and since they hate that name, that's what I've decided to call them as well. Groups such as Daesh will remain a threat as long as receptive ears are found for their poison and the gullible can be persuaded that murderers are martyrs. But they will also continue to feed off the chaos and civil wars in places such as Libya, Yemen, and most of all Syria, where President Assad has led his country into disaster. As Secretary of State, I visited Mr. Assad not long after he took office, succeeding his father, who called himself a lion but had the temperament of a mule. We hoped at the time, because the new president belonged to a younger generation, he might open his country to political and economic reform. Instead, he has shown himself to be every bit as stubborn as his father. The result has been economic stagnation, and for the past 4 years, a sectarian war that has forced half of Syria's population, more than 11 million people, from their homes, creating a humanitarian catastrophe in the region and a refugee crisis in Europe. I can't think of a time when there have been more overlapping and competing crises in one region of the world, and there's no predicting how this will play out. Indeed, we now face the danger that the conflict in Syria will devolve further into a proxy battle between Shiite Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia and its allies, and perhaps between Russia and the United States. One thing I've learned is that in the Middle East, a bad situation can always get worse. And that's why it's important that all of the parties to the Syrian conflict are now coming to the table to talk about a political resolution to the war. Of course, the problems in the Middle East are not the only global challenge that should concern us today. For example, there remains the unsettled situation in Ukraine, where Russia's illegal intervention has given anyone who lived through the Cold War a most unwelcome feeling of déjà vu. For 18 months, the United States and our allies in Europe have stood together, by and large, in opposing Russia's actions in Ukraine. As a result, Russia is isolated diplomatically and hurting economically. But that has not been enough to change the calculus of President Putin, who proves that leaders of great countries are most dangerous when they make up their own facts. There has been much speculation in Washington and other capitals about President Putin's ultimate objectives in Ukraine. I cannot claim to know what those are. I am not his psychiatrist. But one thing that is clear to me is that Putin would like nothing more than to split the United States and the European Union on this issue, and he would rather have a political and economic basket case on his border than a successful, stable democracy that would undermine his own narrative to the Russian people. Despite the best efforts of Russia, Ukraine is making progress in reforming its economic and fulfilling its democratic potential. And if Ukraine is succeeding, that means Putin is failing, which may partially explain his attention-diverting adventure to Syria. As Russia's intervention in the Middle East shows, none of the world's conflicts and challenges can be viewed in isolation from each other. In Afghanistan, our partners on the ground and our adversaries are waiting to see whether these events will cause the international community to divert its attention away from that critical effort. In the South China Sea, and a certain